So yeah, today's topic is on going overseas, what you need to know first. And there's definitely a lot you need to know first as an artist touring overseas, and also many things that I can tell you that I found out firsthand. So I'll be sharing some of those with you. And I like to give the perspective for artists that are traveling from US to overseas, and whether that be overseas specifically. I'm experienced in traveling with tours and booking tours in European countries and in Canadian countries, which not really overseas. However, it still requires a lot of planning and a lot of knowing ahead before you go. And then we'll also cover, it'll be very brief on both topics. We'll also cover for artists wanting to travel from other countries to the US and to tour here. So some things will be similar and some things will vary. And I'll start out with the perspective of the bands traveling from US to overseas as in Europe, and then I'll point out any differences as it goes that may apply to Canada. And so that is our outline of the call. And just before we dive into that, does anybody on the call have any kind of a perspective for this or plans to tour in the near future?
Well, I'll chime in. Thank you, Sherry. This is Brian Jones. And yeah, I would like to do both local short tours around California. I'm interested in also absolutely going overseas and experiencing that. And I've talked to my band about it, and they're ready to go. And it's just a matter of having the right venue and the right tour schedule. And I'm excited to hear about today's topic.
Thank you, Brian Jones, from the Brian Jones Rock and Roll Revival Band. Awesome.
Thanks.
So the first thing what you need to do as an artist and a band leader taking your group overseas is to make sure that everybody in your group is able to travel overseas, and that would mean that they have a valid passport, which is expired at least 1 year after the travel ends. So it may sound basic, but it's definitely important to check with your band members and make sure that they have that document, that key doc. And also, are they able to travel, for any number of reasons, check with them. And depending on which nationality they are, even if they're living in the US, they may have some other passports or travel documents and certain travel restrictions. So that's a key thing to find out. And also, of course, that they need to know they can take the time away to get over, and be off the grid here in the States for however long you're planning to tour. So that's the key point number one. Second would be visas, if there's any type of a visa requirement for the country that you're going to. And generally, if you're traveling to Europe, there won't be these days, but still it's really good to check on the Department of State website any current travel advisories for the area that you plan to travel to, and to do that in advance. And then the third thing, it's really key, I would suggest to get an international driver's license. At least 1 or 2 members of your entourage that are traveling, whether you're going to plan on using that or not, it's really important to have, I feel, in your travel documents, because you never know what's going to come up. Conditions may change when you're over there. You may need to rent a vehicle, and it's a key point to have that international driver's license so you can get one and rent it if you need to. The best and easiest way to get that, go to your local AAA office, and I mean, they're amazing. You can get everything you need for your trip there, and travel plans. They can help you with maps and routing, and get that international driver's license. And to get that, they'll let you know what you need. Basically, you need a passport photo, 1 or 2, just like the same kind that you need for your passport, which passports take a lot longer to get these days than they used to. So that's another reason why, just to backtrack, it's important to get that knocked off the list as soon as possible. And then another key item that you need is your credit card, and it could be a debit card. I've traveled with just debit card over there, and it works fine if you have a MasterCard or Visa, and or credit card that has the chip and PIN. So these days, especially in Europe, it's a lot more necessary to have the PIN and chip. But I have to admit, I was just over there a month ago, and I had a debit card without a chip and PIN, and I survived. So I wasn't renting a vehicle that time or doing some of the things that I did when I was on the band tour when I had the chip and PIN. So if you can get it, it just happened that I have a credit union that doesn't have that technology, but pretty much every card does these days. So I'm just letting you know it's possible to get along without it, but I would really advise to make sure you take a bank card that has it, because it could restrict you if you, especially if you need to do some vehicle rental, and you don't want your tour breaking down for little details like that.
Gotcha.
Going on. Is that your line or somebody? Could you put the mute on, or do you need some technical support? Okay. Stop, but I'm getting a lot of crackling noise on the line. Okay.
I'm on mute.
Oh, that's strange. I will have our video editor edit that crackling out. Okay, so the next thing, well, okay, while we're talking about credit cards, in case your band or your performance group really has some awesome bookings over there and you make bank, just be aware that there are monetary restrictions on the amount of currency that you can legally bring back into the States. You don't really have to worry about that until you hit the $10,000 threshold. So kudos to you if that's a concern, because you need to know about the limits also on your what items. If you're purchasing things, there's a dollar amount on what you can bring back with you when you travel over the border and immigrations back to the US. So check the US immigrations restrictions and information on the website before you go. And it's also a good idea. There's another website that you can go to as far as helping to get early or easy access back into the States, and an app that you can sign up on the just on your phone, and you can do some of the work in advance before you travel. So I'm going to post those links below the video, and they'll give you more insight and information on how to speed up and ease your passage through the customs and through the immigrations, and to make everything smoother when you return back across the States. If you haven't traveled overseas in the last 6 to 18 months, there's been a lot of changes at a lot of the airports. And so it's important to know what's current before you actually go. And speaking of the actual going across borders, so there's well, let's talk about instruments first. If you have instruments, which probably you do, you're going to have to think about, are you going to carry your instrument with you and take it on the trip? And if so, there are it's good to call your airline first and to find out if it's allowable to carry your instrument onto the flight. There's been some recently or relatively new legislation passed by the FAA that requires airlines to allow musicians to carry on their instruments. And guitars seem to be a big issue, and also some bigger horns and other pieces of instrumentation, that it's important to call the airline and ask them if it's okay, because technically you are allowed to. And I'll also post the links about the information that tells about the initiative. And I did a lot of research before I traveled last you're with the band to Europe, and it's not really clear if you will be able to carry on your instrument until you actually get to the gate. So to check in, which makes it a little bit stressful and sketchy from my perspective. So I would say, if possible, to have a backup plan, but do your research before you go and call ahead to the airline, and especially be early to the flight, because if there is an issue, you give yourself at least time to talk to people, to negotiate, to try and figure out a way, to get your sweet talk yourself to get it on. And also, if you get there early, you have less chance of the flight already being full and booked, where they're going to turn away excess baggage or oversized items that they may not reject earlier in the process. So definitely do your homework on that as early as possible, and hope for the best. Do whatever you can to envision a positive outcome about that. Because actually everything did work out for us in the group I was traveling with, and there were 11 members and all kinds of instruments like crazy. So I would just advise also to pack them very well, because even on the flight, things could happen. Again, there's some links I can send. And then this was not an issue for us in the group I traveled with, but in my research that I did, what I read was it's important to document your instruments, that you own them before you go, just from the perspective of perhaps getting taxed or custom checked immigration, issues when you come back, not immigration issues, but at customs. If there's any question whether you had the instrument before you went or if you acquired it while you were traveling, you could have your documentation to avoid that, to show, so that you don't end up with some issues coming back. Like I said, that didn't happen to us, but it was a little bit of a concern and a stress for me. I don't even have the instrument, but I was concerned something was going to happen to the musicians. So yeah, that's something to be aware of. Next thing is electricity. Yay! Okay, where are you going to be? Unless you're doing acoustic sets, you're going to need electricity. And of course, there's the power difference from the 110 and the 220 volts, okay? So I can't tell you how many advisories I gave before we traveled, but not only is there the power difference, there's the adapters, because the plugs don't fit into the wall in Europe, and if you do fit it in, you're not going to, but if you don't have the right adapter and converter, you're going to blow up the power watt. So when we got there, of course, some of the musicians didn't have all the necessary things. So make sure you get that before you travel, because you're not going to be able to even plug in and charge your laptop or your phone or anything. So, and if you travel frequently, I'm sure that's not an issue for you, or you already have your travel kit with all of those things ready to go. However, when you're traveling with the band or as a performing artist, you're going to need to think about extra power. How many outlets are there going to be? How many converters and adapters do you need? In this case, we had to also purchase the power conditioner over there, because I'm not going to go into why, but you might need a power conditioner, and you'll want to check with the somebody who's doing your sound over there, whether you're going to bring your sound person or you're going to have the venue provide the sound, so you know what else is necessary. If you're going to bring any amps with you, which I would say to try to avoid, but I know for us it was a little bit necessary. So you need to be strategic about the sound and about your needs for your stage presence and the electricity power. While we're on that topic. So, yes, something else came to mind about that, the power. Well, let's move on to this part about the back line. So a lot of venues, at least in Europe, they have back lines sometimes more frequently than in the States, I found. And you'll be able to use what they have. So it's important to find out with the venue before you go what's going to be available and what your band can use. A couple times, or at least once, it happened that the band I was working with, we were able to use the stand-up bass and the drum kit from the band before. This was actually in the Czech Republic, and that was a venue that was really hard to talk to communicate with ahead of time. Like, as far as emails, they were almost never answered, and then I would call, and there was a big time difference by the time they came into the club at night and the time I could reach somebody there. It was like strategic to try and communicate. And I actually ended up flying into Prague like a day or two early from the band from Brussels, just so I could actually talk with the people in person to make sure all of their needs were met before they performed. And the interesting thing is, after all of that, I had gone to the venue the night before, and the back line was there. Everything looked good. I watched the band play. I spoke with the owner and the manager, and we checked, and the sound person, we checked everything off the list. And then it turned out that the bass, the stand-up bass, was not a part of the back line like I understood that it was. It was actually the bass of the player that was on the stage that night. So the night of the show, there was no stand-up bass with the opening act that was supposed to be part of the back line. So we had to work things out from there. What happened in the end was we were able to borrow the stand-up bass from the guy that had it the night before. That was his. It was not part of the back line. But it's little things like that. And this goes back to our initial call when we talked about booking gigs. If you remember, do not book a tour during Mercury retrograde. Okay? This was straight up in the middle, full force Mercury retrograde. Everything that could have gone awry, trust me, it did, or it just about did, and we caught it before it fell off the edge, okay? So it's little details of communication. So speaking of little details of communication, the contract and the agreement is very important to know before you go, especially if you're going on a trip to Europe. And I may not have pointed it out, but Europe is very expensive. Okay, this year is less expensive than last year, but still, when you're with a group of people over there traveling, there are so many unforeseen expenses that come up that you really need to be prepared and have extra funds available, and you've got to make sure you're clear about what the band's getting paid and how, when. Is there accommodations included, or can they throw some meals to the band? If they don't have accommodations, they may have a place they can refer you. We had actually really good luck as far as nothing, everybody paying as they said they would and on time. And I was very hands-on with the venue contacts as far as before we went and keeping in communication and when we were there and being present at the show and before and after and during. And we didn't have any problems, but also we found that there were a few times when the venues provided the accommodations. They had a place nearby or close to the site or connections, and they often provided meals. So that worked out. So the other back to instruments, backline, and we didn't talk about renting instruments. So if you do not take those instruments of your own and you don't travel with them for some reason, it's possible to rent them in Europe. I'll tell you, it's a pain in the frickin' ass. It really is. It really is. Mainly because some places don't rent instruments, okay? So it's really hard to find a place that rents them, first of all, and that rents what you want, and it's super expensive, like out of control. You're gonna have to negotiate a couple times. Everywhere we rented instruments, which was in basically every city we went to, but the main ones that were expensive were Paris and Berlin. Seriously, we had to negotiate. I had to talk to them like 3 different times to bring the price down to something that was reasonable for the like 1 or 2 gigs that we were renting them for, because they'll try and charge you something crazy. And luckily, my contact spoke English at the gear rental place in Paris. He's amazing. I would totally recommend him. They do big productions and they have every gear, every sound item. And then in Berlin, they spoke English, but they speak German, so it worked. So you need to think about brushing up on your language skills too before you go. It would be good to know at least some basic phrases, like be a level 1 of the language for the countries that you're going to, at least a half of a level 1. If you're going to multiple countries and you can manage to learn a little bit of like Spanish, German, French, I don't know where you travel, but pick the languages that will be spoken the most and get yourself learning them. And if you need some help with that, contact me too, and I have some resources. Some are even free. And so we are on transportation. So transportation is a very big expense. It's possible to do, if you're in Europe, to do something on rail or public transportation as your mode. However, then you're reliant on the schedules, okay? Schedules can be sketchy, especially in Europe. Granted, public transportation is great. Europeans survive and thrive on public transportation. But when you're in a band and you have gigs to get to, you have to be places on time at a certain day. It does not work. It's not reliable. I would not recommend it. Okay, we had, I don't even know what, we had 12 days and 10 gigs, or 10 days and 7 gigs, but it was pretty much back to back, okay? So these guys and girl did not have a chance to, they would not have time to catch a train, okay? The other thing is that there's strikes. Probably 5 or 6 times when I've been in Europe, I've been affected with my transportation because of strikes. So that's another thing. If there's a strike, and it's very common in France and Italy, not to mention probably Greece, if you...
Civil disobedience, it's so cool. We love it, but it's hard to travel.
Okay, that was all static. What did you say?
I'm sorry, it was static. I said civil disobedience. That's great. And it is hard to travel.
What is great?
Okay, I guess it's hard to hear me. I'm just going to stay on mute. It's okay. I'm sorry.
I want to know what was great.
Civil disobedience, protests, strikes like they do in Europe, in France and Italy. I wish the U.S. did more of that, but it does make it very difficult for travel. I've been caught in that as well in France.
Right, because it's unexpected. And it ruins your plans, yeah.
Yep.
So that's something to consider. The other part about that is that I do want to give a shout out to Uber, okay? Uber freaking saved my life when I was there, because the that combined with, we had the rental vehicles, but the Uber it's freaking expensive for one thing. And I didn't mention, but every time you take an Uber, depending on your bank card, every time you make a transaction, you're going to get a fee, like an international transaction fee. And there's also another second fee that's a percentage or something. So it really gets out of control with managing expenses. So check that before you go, because granted, the Uber was great. It totally racked up a lot of charges because they seem like small fees, but if you have like 24, 12 or 18 euro charges, it totally adds up. And so it was great because, for example, I had to get flyers printed and go to the copy shop, and thank goodness that guy spoke English too, but to pick up things and carry them, and it's not possible on like the metro, which is fast and great. I'm talking about Paris specifically for the inner city transportation. But if you're going to have to carry gear, like I had to go and find a store, electronics, like a Fry's, to buy the power conditioner, and that was really heavy, and then carry it, and then other things. So if you're going to have to haul things around, the public transportation might not be practical. And so that's why the Uber is great. Or if it's at strange locations that you don't know how to get to, like where we had to go to rent the van for the Mercedes Sprinter tour van. It was in a strange place that was hard to find, and so Uber's good because then the Uber driver, if you get a cool one, which I always seem to, they could also translate for you and to interpret with the person at the place you're going if you needed help. But so Uber could be a helpful solution. In some countries, though, it was not legal, so that got a little bit tricky. But if you're renting the vehicles, that's a pain in the ass, sorry to say. It's best to do as much as you can ahead of time, for sure. And that can be difficult depending if you can get someone who speaks your language or not, and also that responds in a timely manner, if at all. And if you're communicating on email, if you get the same person, it's helpful. Sometimes you get different people. And for me, it was hard to actually talk to somebody on the phone because a lot of those rental car places, they didn't have phone numbers that you could actually talk to someone in the office. If you can get a contact at a rental place, it's good. And there's some places that rent specifically vans and tour vans, or tour vans, ones that you could use for that purpose. They have some restrictions about car seats. And we, of course, were traveling with a keyboardist and singer who had her baby with her. I know. So you have to find out like these things. I didn't find out all these little details about the car seat restrictions until we got there. So my suggestion would be don't travel with a baby. Okay. But if things happen, then do that research before you go. Okay. And there's also, I want to say on the equipment. So, I mean, the transportation. If you do not want to rent the vehicle at the airport. So I think that's the most expensive for sure. So you don't want to rent it in the city center after you get to the airport. So you can do your research online and find a rental place that's outside of the airport. And also taxes will be different and less if you do that. And you can find a place that rents more like industrial instead of going, I mean, I remember I researched there were some Hertz and some budget rental locations that just do vans and more of not industrial, but they have like vans and that kind of bigger vehicles. So you might want to check into that. It was kind of a hassle for us because we had to get a big car, a Mercedes Sprinter, and so I actually went and test drove one here in the States to find out what it would be like to drive, because I had to drive it part of the time. And then we also had to rent a smaller Renault for the people with the baby. So if you need to have multiple vehicles, try and figure out, passengers and space. I had to check out the car here, the Sprinter, to find out if it would hold all the equipment and the people, to gauge how much vehicle space we needed for the tour. So another part about the vehicles is that you have to be aware for unexpected tolls all over the place on European highways. It's like toll after toll after toll after toll. I mean, seriously, it's just crazy. And then there's those, tickets for parking, because it's really hard to park there, especially a tour van on those little streets. So tickets come up, another unexpected expense. We got a lot of tickets, okay? And then there's also speeding tickets that come in the mail after you get back, because those cameras are taking pictures, and I mean, who knows what the tickets were for. But we got a lot of them. So I would say read up about as much as you can. Have somebody drive who's a good driver. Luckily for us, the boyfriend or the partner of the musician that had the baby, he was a driver for UPS or something during his day job. So he did a lot of the driving of the one or the other of the vehicles. So it's great if you could have somebody designated as a driver, and ideally, like that driver could also be your sound person, because and your equipment hauler, because it was a lot of work to also haul the equipment in and out of the van and into the venues, and while you're trying to figure out the next place to get to. It's a lot of logistics. I would suggest you hire somebody just that does logistics. And that person would ideally be separate from somebody who does the promotions. Okay? And then the tour van driver and the sound person. So that's like 3 extra people I would suggest to bring. In our case, I was 3 of those 3 people, and the other driver guy was one of them. But those are some things to think about. And I can see we're going to have a second session on this, because we got about halfway through the list for US to overseas. So does anybody have any questions or comments right now? We're about getting close to our time. Any shares?
Well, how many tours have you done over to Europe? And I was thinking that maybe we were going to talk about other places in the world, but Europe is very desirable for lots of reasons to go tour. Just wondering how many times you've been over to Europe with fans?
Yeah. Well, the reason I'm talking about Europe is because most of the musicians that I talk to and work with want to go to Europe. I know a couple who, there's a few who I'd say maybe want to go to South America, Japan, and Asia, and then Canada. But I've done the one tour to Europe with the band, and I will never do it again.
Oh, wow. Wow, okay.
As far as traveling, okay, with the band and even organizing, it's a lot of work, and so it takes a lot. And these are just some of the things to think about. So I want you guys to be prepared to know it's super lot involved. And we're talking about like indie artists, an amateur artist. Of course, if you're a big professional and you have somebody doing all this for you that you can bring on and work with, that's great. But on the indie route, it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of time, and it's a lot of expense, and yeah, it's got its moments, you know. It can be exciting. The gigs were amazing. That's the best and most important thing. The venues were packed. The gigs were great. The crowd loved the band. When you're on stage, you know, and everything comes together, that's the moment when you know why you're doing it. But in between, it's a lot of stress, actually, I would say. And
Right.
that was with a 12-person group, though. So if you're with um, a smaller entourage, it could be a different experience.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for being on the call. And I think actually, even though we're talking about Europe, everything would apply towards other countries as far as the items that you need to address. I just didn't have the personal experience of doing it in South America or Asia. But I think everything is going to be the same, that you'll have to figure out and talk to somebody who's done it, or get in contact with somebody over there. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Well, I thank you for being a participant today and for showing up, and thank you for doing what you do. Your music is amazing, and I'm sending you all the best for happy travels and tours with your band.
Thank you, Sherry.
Welcome. Brian Jones of the Brian Jones Rock and Roll Band. Namaste.
Okay, namaste. Talk to you later.
Ciao.